Welcome to the Casual Bois Podcast. I'm Brandon,
And I'm Francisco.
and we're here to talk about movies, TV, current events, memes, and the internet.
But keep it casual.
Yes, of course, we always keep it casual. Now, Francisco,
Yes, Brandon.
I'd like to have a casual conversation about comics.
Ooh, who should we have that casual conversation with?
Well, to have this casual conversation, we have a very casual person himself, Anthony Tran.
How's it going, y'all?
What's up, Chan? Good to have you.
Good to be here.
This is your premiere on our podcast.
Yes, it is.
So we've known Tran for a good number of years.
I think I've known him since 2012.
That's 8 years running.
Wow, 8 years.
Yeah. Like every time we have somebody on this show, we look back and like, wow, that's a good chunk of our life that we've known this person.
Yeah.
And funny enough, one of the first things when I first got to know Tran was that he was a very, very enthusiastic comic book lover. One of the first things we bonded over, and it was, it was great to find a kindred spirit in that sense. You seem surprised, Tran. Why is that?
To be honest, I kind of forgot what we first talked about.
That's okay. That just shows how
I don't
special our
remember.
relationship is.
Yeah, I remember there were like long periods of time, and this podcast is probably going to be the same, where I would just ask him things that happened in comic books because I didn't want to read them. And I still kind of do that with manga.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're like, you were the encyclopedia for the longest time.
Yeah, actually, the reason that like I thought of him and this topic was because we were talking about the upcoming season of Attack on Titan. This is the fourth season, and so I was asking Tran like, oh, what was I asking? Something about?
If it's because you were listening to a podcast where some of the hosts were hyping it up, and you asked me if given where the manga is, if that's going to live up to it, if there's an end game, and I was like, oh, definitely.
Yeah, because I want, I don't know, I don't want the whole Full Metal Alchemist thing to happen again, where it ends before, or the show ends before the manga. So it's like,
Yeah.
it's like you hit or miss with the ending. Which I like the original Full Metal Alchemist ending, but
Yeah.
that's just me.
I think that's kind of like the worry right now, given the pandemic.
Yeah.
But if Attack on Titan is going to have that season split, as they've done with the previous seasons, then I think they could make it work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm glad you guys kind of touched on that because in regarding with comics, now that, it's going on for a couple of years now, like the whole sensation that, comics is now mainstream. It always had a very strong following, but now, your average viewer either knows about it through either the movies or they've eventually gotten to read it because of, the success of Marvel movies and the success of DC or the infamous success of DC movies, however you take it. Before we kind of go into like all that, do you guys remember like what was your first exposure to like, if not reading comics, just knowing about like the world of comic book characters?
So I'll go first
Yeah.
because mine's probably short. So I don't think I read a proper comic book until like middle school, but I think that was a graphic novel, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that counts.
For the sake of it, since we're just doing general comics, I will count graphic
Okay,
novels.
Graphic novels. Graphic novels. The first thing I read was like in middle school was I obviously was not I did not like reading very much, but it was a Spider-Man one,
Okay,
and I still have it actually. I still have it in my room.
nice.
But the real like proper comic I read was the Dark Knight Returns. From Frank Miller.
Miller, yeah.
Yeah, because I think I'm very much inspired by things I see on YouTube. As Trent was talking about, I was watching that podcast, which led to this. That podcast, by the way, is a Trash Taste podcast. It's like new, and it's with a bunch
That's
of
the name of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you were just describing the podcast.
No, yeah, it's all about anime. But anyways, it was the very first. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have like a head for comics. I think because like it was interesting to read, but it was just kind of like looking around and stuff. Like I don't know, maybe because like it was like from the '80s, so it's kind of different than now.
Yeah.
But like if I like moving forward, eventually I like started getting into manga. Not very much, but like manga is probably the easiest way to like consume content that I know. You could just like read like 50 chapters of a manga in like 30 minutes, and like And, like, you're just like, whoa, where did the time go?
Yeah.
Especially if it's like, like towards the end where you're just like you're just like looking through everything. You're just trying to get to the next page. So yeah, I think my comic days are probably more ahead of me than behind me.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny you mentioned that. Just quick add-on is that when we used to live together, I would sometimes come into the room and you'd be watching that one guy on YouTube, and he would talk about the history of a certain character.
Rob.
Yes,
yeah, Rob Jefferson.
Yeah,
yeah.
Because I had watched him before too, and so I was like, oh, great, he's catching up on his studies.
Yeah, his voice is somewhere in between ours.
Yeah.
So he's like softer, but he's like deeper. He's softer like my side, but like deeper like yours.
Yeah. What about you, Trey?
My first exposure, it wasn't with comic books per se, but with TV shows. Y'all remember those like 90s X-Men and Spider-Man TV
You know what?
shows?
I'm glad you brought that up because we can condense our answers because that was mine too.
Yeah.
Mine was the Spider-Man.
Everything that came out of Fox Kids.
Yes,
and that was pretty much my first exposure, and I kind of left it at that until I think like high school. And Watchmen was like the first graphic novel that I would read, and somehow it led me to reading Marvel and DC comics. But I've noticed like I would only be able to bring myself to read the ones that were made from 2000 and onwards, because before that the dialogue I found was kind of cheesy, so I couldn't get on with it.
So you mentioned Watchmen, Tran. Did you watch the HBO show?
I haven't seen the HBO show. I've only watched the movie.
Okay. Do you have like Hulu?
Not at the moment.
Oh, because I think Hulu. I don't know who else, but I think for sure Hulu was showing it, like, last weekend for free.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I think because it does have a lot of like, racial stuff in it, like racial tension and stuff. Like, I don't remember. So I had one of my friends let me borrow the comic book, the graphic novel for Watchmen in high school, and then I just like, I never read it. I had it for like a year, and I never read it. Yeah, and then I gave it back, or like he asked for it back, and then I felt like I missed my chance to ever read it.
Yeah.
I liked the movie, I guess, the Zack Snyder movie. I didn't think it was bad.
Yeah.
For sure. It was just really, really slow, and like having read the graphic novel, do you think that's appropriate, or was?
To have read the graphic novel before watching the movie?
No, do you think that like the pacing from the movie, like how like slow and like brooding it was, do you think that was accurate to the novel? Or
it was, in adapting it, I think it did the best that it could, especially if you watch the director's cut, because even the graphic novel, I mean, it could feel slow at times.
It is, yeah, because there's a lot of explanation.
Yeah.
Since there's a cast of the Watchmen, everybody gets their own like sections of the books that.
Like Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the movie kind of skipped out on showing some character context and some plot stuff, but I think it still held true in the same way that the graphic novel did, which was to kind of show how things play out given the circumstances of the time that they lived in. And I kind of got that hint from watching some clips on YouTube with the new HBO show that it would kind of tackle on certain themes that are playing out in society and how that impacted them.
A lot of like the moral gray quandaries that happen with that. Yeah.
So I don't know if this is spoilers, but there's like a character, like the original hero. I forgot his name. Something with a mask. Masked
Oh, the
Justice.
Hooded
Justice. Yeah. Is that in the graphic novel, or is it just kind of like in the background?
Yeah, he's there.
Like he's alive?
No, so he was like the previous generation before the Watchmen, and so he makes a couple of appearances, and in the original Watchmen graphic novel, that's it, because after that they don't really talk about him, but there's some notes in between chapters that talk about what may have happened to him, and then a couple of years ago they did a whole series dedicated to the previous generation of heroes before the Watchmen, and it explores more about what he did. And,
I remember that.
Yeah.
I never had the time to pick it up and actually read it, but I remember that they were trying to bring Watchmen back to life again by novels.
Mm.
And
Was that?
was it written by the same guy, original author, or no?
I think it was written by different people.
Yeah, probably not. That guy's too like he's too much of like an artist to go back
go
to something
back,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I think.
That's a
What
good way to
was?
put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the nice way to put it. What I remember seeing like covers or something. It was like Superman and like it was like in a Watchmen book or something.
Mhm.
What was that? Was that what you're talking about, or is that something else?
That was something else, but I'm glad you've kind of brought that up so we can segue as well, because there was a certain moment where like they're mashing up the DC universe with the Watchmen universe,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know whether that was a marketing just to, like bring Watchmen back into like the mainstream, or it was just to make DC Comics more like quote unquote diverse, so they have more things to kind of go off of, because maybe they were running a little low on the energy at that point. And so it touches on something I'm glad you brought up, and especially because Tran is here, he can also give us insight between how like the mainstream comics are versus like say graphic novels or some other ones that aren't as mainstream, because something that critiques are given regardless of if it's like a Marvel or DC thing is that they've kind of run out of ideas at this point. You can't have anything new. And then you have the other ones, like, for example, Hellboy. I don't think they're doing any more Hellboy stuff. Not talking about the movie that came out that apparently people didn't like. But
That came out and I didn't even realize it.
yeah. But I remember reading a lot of, like, the comics of Hellboy, and, like, it has something completely different than, what you see in Marvel and DC. And that's not bashing Marvel and DC. I love their comics. It's just there's a simple touch to it, but also very complex in there as well. And I don't know if it's a smaller corporation or something like that kind of goes into it. I don't know if you guys have any insight or thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking of asking Tran, since you like do read both like manga and comics, why do you think it's so much easier for like new manga to come up, but like new comics, like I don't know, like I feel like you as big as like an indie comic would get, you like might never see it turn into like a show or a movie or anything. But like with manga, like it's like almost everything has a shot. Why do you think that is?
That's a good point.
With say just Marvel and DC publications, you have a variety of authors as well as artists working on a run or storyline run, and every time that run is completed, it's kind of like inherited by the next author, who kind of adds in their take to what's already existing, or they'll just what's the term where they can just retcon it completely and try to do something else. And so I think at times it could go both ways, for better or for worse, where the quote unquote progress made into the universe or the characters in Marvel and DC comics, it could cause backlash or it could be praised, and there isn't exactly consistency there in that sense, because you have a variety of authors working on it, and sometimes you kind of have to weigh how much you want to stick to this sort of tradition established by the original author and what they intended for the character versus evolving the character, because any work of fiction and creativity kind of takes on cues of our daily reality, and it's kind of on how it's executed that kind of dictates how the public will receive it. With manga, there's like a dedicated person working on the storyline, and well, I mean, it kind of depends, but you at least get a sense that there's a sort of established plan, and I kind of feel that the Japanese authors who kind of work on these manga, the way they approach writing and the themes that they try to put in are different from the way that I guess American or European authors try to convey their creativity. I can't exactly explain any further than that, but I kind of feel that there is a very big difference in how they choose to kind of express these themes. And for the most part, you do have your goofy manga every now and then, but with some of the big names out there like Attack on Titan or My Hero Academia, I feel that the themes that are tackled very well, and there's always an added layer of complexity um, once you get past the filler.
Hmm. Do you think that? Because like I don't know how much you know about like the original like comics, like whenever like all these characters were first being made. But do you think that like because these comics came from like the creators, like Stan Lee would create these, and then he had his own company, basically. So he kind of had to do company stuff, and then other people took over. Do you think that that's kind of one of the bigger differences? Is that they're like the guy Isayama, like when he's writing Attack on Titan, he isn't like making a company and then letting someone else continue it, right? Like he's making like he's telling his entire story.
And he's focused on just that.
Yeah. So do you think that that's like one of the bigger things too? Is that it's a lot more of like I don't know, like maybe in Japan, like people take their roles more seriously. So like here, you'll have like the comic book writer turn into like the comic book like editor and then like executive. Or there, it's like if you're a writer, you write and you do your own thing. If you're like a businessman, you business. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I definitely think that the business side of things does impact how creativity is sort of handled. And any further than that, I guess you would have to kind of look at the structure of how things are run in Japan versus here in the U.S.
Mm.
Because at least I feel that with U.S. culture in general, and maybe that fits with business, is that you have to meet a certain deadline. And especially with some comics nowadays, there might be like a sort of quota on certain themes that you have to kind of convey
Mm.
and kind of bring in the sales. And if money is sort of the metric to determine success, then it kind of goes on from there.
Mhm.
But I feel like there's a greater I mean, given the success of how manga is, I feel like there's a greater respect to respecting the creativity and vision of the author and allowing that author to do what he or she intends, and the success is the fruit of it.
Mm. So in 70 years, we're not gonna have like 4 different continuities for Saitama, just like.
Jeez, I kind of hope not. I mean, I feel like we sometimes talk about this whenever there's like a reboot or a reimagining of certain movies, TV shows, or literature. There's a sort of disdain for it. That, or we kind of just got bored with the idea of um, reimagining things to fit the current times.
Well, I can think of one anime-ish that kind of is guilty of that, and it's Dragon Ball Z.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Full Metal.
Full Metal,
No,
I will say
Full Metal is
Full Metal,
to be praised and glorified. Dude. No one talk about Full Metal.
Because Dragon Ball Z, and maybe this just speaks to its massive global success, because it became such deep-seated here in the West, but it also was very much like followed over in Japan. And like I don't think anybody can deny like globally like people will know what Dragon Ball Z is. But then also there was a time when they started doing the movies, and then they started when they brought in Super Saiyan God level, and then Dragon Ball Super came out, and they kind of just like retold a bunch of the stories from the movies into like the TV series. And
Yeah.
I was like, it just because you brought up the continuity part was very interesting, and of all, I guess, biggest people who do that is definitely Marvel and DC. Whenever they do a certain storyline or a certain thing that happens in the timeline, like, okay, we're kind of done with this. We don't know where else to go from. Let's restart the clock, do a flashpoint, or just destroy this universe and then bring it into another one.
Dragon Ball might be one of the exceptions to everything that I just talked about, because I remember when there was GT, there was massive backlash. And I grew up actually loving it, and then when Super came out, there was also a lot of backlash.
Yeah,
because
Super had it better though, because they're like, okay, pretend GT didn't happen. You're Super now. This is what you want, right?
Yeah.
And then like the animation was really bad, so they like had to like. That was like the biggest issue, I think, was the animation.
Yeah, and then right after Super ended, the Dragon Ball Broly movie. It was
Super's done? I didn't know that. Okay.
It ended, but like they're not done.
Okay,
the manga is still going.
It's like Pokemon. I was like, it's done, but then
yeah.
like I have a new thing coming out to add
I
to it.
think the viewership kind of dictated that. But yeah, I mean, Broly the reimagined Broly movie, when that came out, I loved that movie.
Mm.
It they went, the art style was kind of like the modern take of Dragon Ball Z, and they add a lot of depth to the Broly character, and I like, and they also added a little bit more layers to the fusion technique. In general, I thought that movie was great and probably perhaps what could have been Super, but so there's a lot of flip flopping in terms of how well received the show would be.
Yeah.
So it's what with Japanese creativity, that's one of the exceptions to everything that I just talked about.
In my mind, the original Broly movie is amazing, but it's like really not. Like I think with a lot of Dragon Ball like stuff, like I don't know, it just seems so like the moments there are so impactful, like the cool moments, that you really do forget about the crap, like all the filler stuff, like Snake Way. Like I barely remember anything about that, but I remember that Snake Way, like the concept was so cool.
Yeah.
Same thing with like the stuff in between Cell and Boo, where it's just like Gohan. They were trying to make Gohan the main character, and then nobody wanted Gohan because, to be honest, he was kind of lame. But then they just like completely, they completely nuked him, and he's just like a nerd now.
Yeah.
And I was like,
you think they learned their mistake with GT because everyone wanted Gohan to be back, and at the time when he did come back in the end, he didn't do much.
Yeah. He was already like, because that was his daughter, right?
Yeah.
The one in GT. Does she still exist in Super? Do you know?
As a baby.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
So I'm glad, again, touching on these subjects that you guys talk about, like, they have an existing character and then they'll bring him back for, like, a different way, but it's still the same character, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that, and, okay, let's just face it. We're just going to talk about, like, how the biggest purveyors of the DC and Marvel, they always tend to do that with their characters. In a way, like, can you blame them for that, or is it something that they need to stop doing for that? And not necessarily just on this topic in general, but do you think they're just going to run out of steam at any point, or is there like always going to be an existing like big two?
I think they're running out of steam now. Like, I heard that that DC is like dying right now, and like I don't, because like nobody's reading the comics, and like I think I don't know if they're like gonna be sold to someone, or I don't know. This is very, I saw something on Reddit as like part of like the 1,000 things that I saw that day. But yeah, I was saying like DC wasn't doing very hot. I think there was like it was. Oh, I was looking up news about Rooster Teeth. Or I wasn't looking up, but I saw it, and they were talking about how they're not making a Ruby like a new.
Yes.
They're not continuing the comics anymore. And because DC is just like doing very poorly, and so I don't know if it's like an American thing or what, because like we'll always want to see Superman, but maybe Superman, I don't know. I'll ask y'all. Do you think that Superman and Batman should be replaced, or do you think that they should still maintain their status?
I think they should take a break. Not to disappear completely, but just to have a more supporting role.
Yeah.
Because to the original question, do I think DC's kind of, or I guess both Marvel and DC are kind of, I think they're kind of running out of ideas. Because new comics are released weekly, not necessarily following previous issues, but there's always at least something released weekly, and I can really burn you out. It's like the same issue of Call of Duty, and compared to manga, where depending on the issue, you could have breaks every now and then. Attack on Titan releases monthly, but I do feel that they should have a creative break. And I guess Young Justice is kind of like the most clear example I can think of right now, because it takes on the former sidekicks of the big name superheroes and it explores their journey. And the main superheroes, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, they play the mentor supporting type role. But so there's enough scenes where you could still appreciate the old glory days, but the spotlight's never taken away from the main cast, which is these new generation of heroes.
Yeah.
Which is interesting enough, because I kind of feel that DC animated tends to be very great with story development, and I don't know if it's because of the medium, the time that it allowed them to kind of grow and reevaluate the ideas that they have on the table. But I've noticed that, yeah, their DC animated as well as their TV shows like Doom Patrol right now and Titans. There's a lot of breathing there in that development for their characters to be fleshed out meaningfully too.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go on.
I was thinking that definitely the like lower, for some reason, whenever DC has like lower stakes stuff, they do a lot better.
Oh yeah.
like when it's not like world ending stuff, like it does a lot better. So like Flashpoint, that movie, it's, I don't know, I feel like that movie's kind of interesting, like the animated one. It's kind of more interesting than it is good.
Okay.
You know? But
no,
like,
it's fine because I think Trent and I actually have that same take because the Flashpoint paradox, like we both like one of the, and I, again going back to the first things we bonded over was like we both weren't super like stoked about the movie. Like we liked it, but we didn't think it was like the best thing ever made.
Yeah, and I think also part of that was that back then I was more of a purist than anything else compared to nowadays, where I'm a little bit more lenient on creative freedom, and I kind of encourage that. It just depends on the execution, but yeah, I mean, I remember back then when we talked about Flashpoint, I compared it so much to how things played out in the comics and whatnot, and how I felt that the movie, while it did capture some of the main stuff, it was a letdown because it was missing a lot of context, which I thought would have enriched the universe.
Yeah, and there's, I don't know. See, that's the thing about comics that's interesting is that I feel like in general, it's a disservice to make movies about them.
Okay.
Like about the comics. Now, characters,
okay.
But when you make a movie about like whenever they made the Wolverine, so the Wolverine is like the second, because of Frank Miller Wolverine. That was like, I was just on a Frank Miller vibe, I guess.
No,
so I got that like volume. Like it was just about
the Frank Miller's great.
Yeah, it was just about that story.
Yeah.
And that's kind of was one of the bigger influences on the Wolverine movie that came out, not the Origins one, the other one, just the Wolverine. And like
we don't talk about Origins.
Yeah, the parts that
Will.i.am.
Oh gosh, and Mary from Lord of the Rings. Yeah, what was in the movie? Like the stuff that were the references and stuff that were to the original comic book. I thought they were interesting, but I thought they were better as just kind of like Easter eggs or like set dressing, because the story itself is like way different. Like it's like has a lot of the same elements, like with the Silver Samurai and like all this other stuff. But that one was a lot more about like, at least in my memory, it felt like it was a lot more about Logan and Mariko than Logan and this old Japanese dude that he like saved 100 years ago. Which I thought that was an interesting story, but I think that it was very much like in clash like with the original story, where it's like, well, we don't need to know this, but like since I do know it, like I do know the references, it kind of makes like the new thing worse.
Yeah.
But I still love that movie.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought it up, because it was a topic I wanted to see if we could touch on. Was that, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were against like them adapting existing stories like that?
I just think that there's no way to. I want to say that there's no way to do it right. Okay. Like, if I'm being like hand to a Bible, like Civil War was good, but it wasn't like amazing.
No, I think you are absolutely right on that. And well, this is just my 2 cents, because this is not just the MCU that does it, but I'm glad you brought up this thing. Is that when such a big expanded thing like that, such as like the Wolverine or like Civil War happens, the thing with the comics that you can do is that you can give like some breathing room and time, but you get to like really like take your time reading like all this. With the movies or whatever story you're trying to adapt, you're condensed into a time period of doing it. And of course, like you don't, depending on who's directing or who's writing the project, they don't maybe want to rip off everything, because you're just doing like a step-by-step adaptation, and so they want to add their own spin on it or whatever. So like one of the big critiques for Civil War when it was being announced and made is like there's not enough heroes to do it. How are you going to like do a proper adaptation? You're just taking the name of it and just putting it on here. Kind of like what they did with Age of Ultron. They just stick the title, but there's nothing similar between the movie Age of Ultron and the series Age of Ultron as well.
Yeah, I know that when those come out, the pure side of me definitely was the dominant thought in kind of criticizing the movies, because like I really appreciate how the original comics played out and what they were trying to convey, and I mean now I do understand why the movies played out the way it did, even if it does seem superficial. I did understand how it was meant to serve the greater MCU and some of the things that did parallel with the original comics, but I feel like there is definitely a limit to which you can adapt a certain storyline, exactly like Wolverine. Especially since that, if I remember right, that graphic novel was one of the earliest ones to actually show Logan's humanity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Logan's humanity is something that we've kind of got to see with the first X-Men film.
Yeah.
So I kind of have to wonder if that was a struggle for the writers to kind of figure out with a theme that we've seen again and again and again. How do we make it fresh or add more depth to it now?
And I think one of the hardest things is that because of the medium, or I don't even know if it's because of the medium, but I feel like they always like want, like whenever they make a comic book movie, they're like, this is this guy's movie. Like for Infinity War, like this Thanos movie. Whatever else happens, all these other guys are like secondary to Thanos, right? And I think that you can do that, like well, obviously, because that movie's amazing. But like whenever, like whenever they have a Wolverine movie, I understand that it's about Wolverine. But whenever they had Captain America, like Civil War, like who was that movie about?
Yeah.
Like, and then, because like all the other movies, they're always like, you know, especially the titular ones, they're always about one of like the titular character. And even Avengers was about like them coming together, the first one. So then Age of Ultron is like they're already together, so there's like not as much conflict. But then like I don't know, it's just weird because I think the bigger struggle that they have is, do I want to care about them overcoming their obstacles, or do I want to care about what they're fighting?
Right.
Because like, no, I don't care what anyone says. You do not care about the Chitauri at all. Like, in the first Avengers, like Loki's interesting, but like he's more of like the middleman. He's like barely a bad guy in that movie. So like whenever
he plays the role of antagonist, but he's not like the main guy.
Yeah, so he's if anything he's just like a fleeting bad guy because he doesn't like learn anything or anything. He's just he's the same guy at the end, and I think that's like I think that's cool when they do that. Mm-hmm. But whenever you try to make it so that each movie is like, you know, all the characters like go through something, it's just like. This is getting kind of boring. Yeah. Like, can you just like make it that they do things?
Which is actually
nothing really happens.
One of the reasons why I actually personally enjoy Age of Ultron is because of that. It's like, you know, they have like arguments in between, but you know, it's what I kind of see it is like in the scope of everything. It's like, you know, an inside look of what like an average mission looks like, except you know everything went wrong with Ultron. Mm-hmm. But you know, we got to see them in action, and one of the like the I think phrases I take from this when Josh Whedon says, like, you know, there are moments throughout the film when he shows, like, the Avengers actively helping civilians. He's like, well, you know, that's kind of what they would do. You know, it's putting them into action. It's giving them the role that they're supposed to be, not just, like, you know, fighting them all the time.
I think that was my thing with Age of Ultron, and I guess Civil War, is that me personally, I could never really feel the weight of the consequence of their actions in Age of Ultron. Like, yeah, eventually, you know, a city, a literal city that crashes down upon the earth is something to think about, especially if it kind of happened in real life. But I never felt the weight and guilt.
Something to think about.
It's, you know, it's just one of those things to think about. But I never felt the weight of that consequence. Like I just thought it was just something unavoidable. That's just part of the superhero course.
Yeah.
I never felt that struggle, even though that was meant to be a struggle that would, you know, play out in later movies. But I never felt it, so it never really resonated with me.
Yeah, it's almost like
It didn't resonate when that in the beginning of Civil War when that mom confronts Tony. It's like, yeah, my son died.
Yeah.
Sokovia.
So like that.
I don't care about you.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing. That's another thing I wanted to bring up because I was watching whenever Man of Steel came out. Like, I was watching it with my sister and my dad because my dad loves Superman, and the whole time
Really? I didn't know that.
yeah, he loves Superman, and he likes like very few things: Superman, Spider-Man, Jurassic Park. That's all he likes. Not to like a enthusiast level, but anyways, so we were watching that, and he was like, he was just kind of like upset by that movie because there was just too much stuff was breaking, and I'm like, I didn't even notice stuff was breaking. Like, I was just saying, like, wow, this guy's strong.
Yeah.
He's like, I didn't realize that he's just like, for a much better term, like 9/11ing every building in the whole. That's what happened. He like destroyed 2 whole cities.
Like within
He destroyed the IHOP.
It's
Yeah.
You're in the universe where the extraordinary happens on the daily. It's kind of normal and expected.
Yeah.
But maybe it's because with general audiences they project their own daily reality to that of a superhero movie. Maybe that's why. I don't know.
Yeah.
It didn't resonate with me.
One thing that it makes me mad, I don't know why, is that like Superman's out here like saving people all over the world. And I'm like, he doesn't need to do that.
Yeah.
Like he just focus. He probably has like enough stuff just to focus on just in Metropolis. Like, why is he going to like Mexico and like saving these people from a flood? Like,
I feel like they should have handled that where that's because that's like I remember like even in the comics that's like one of the struggles that Superman faces, that with all his power, how is he supposed to save the entire world? And he really shouldn't.
mm-hmm.
There's only so much he can do and should focus on the present moment. But
Yeah.
they never really talked about that.
Yeah, and if it's just Superman, like, that's why I don't mind when there's movies where like, oh, why wasn't Thor in this one? Like, you don't have to explain that. Like,
Yeah.
Thor, like, he has stuff to do. Like,
No, I
like,
understand. Yeah.
like you were saying before, like, oh, they were showing him helping people. Like, yeah, maybe, like, he has a whole planet or dimension or whatever worth of people in
Or he's fighting
Asgard.
somebody else.
Yeah, no, there's all those, like, elves and stuff that hate him. So, like, if he's not here, I buy that he's not there.
Yeah.
Like, whenever people bring up, it's like, well, why wasn't Captain Marvel in anything before? It's like, well,
She was doing something.
yeah, like, there's stuff to do.
Yeah. And that actually I was okay with. When they were like, it's like, oh, they found Ultron, they have to do this with Loki. Plenty of stuff happened. Like, let's go somewhere else.
Yeah.
The galaxy's a big place.
She's like, they don't have you guys, right? Like, they don't have you guys, so I'll go and I'll be the you guys of the whole galaxy or whatever.
And if that was a question that came up in the movie, what would you do? Just wait for them to show up and then you go do something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, Thor isn't here, so I don't know if we
Yeah,
can fight
because then
this
you make it
guy.
null and void. Like, oh,
Yeah.
let's come back later. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? Like, I also realized, like, Marvel has a pretty terrible track record with relatable villains.
Mm.
In terms of like the movie or just in general?
I mean, everything that I just said about not being able to, like me feeling meh about the consequences of the Avengers' actions, and I think that's compounded by villains that kind of just felt shallow. And there were a few moments here and there, like with that second Captain America movie, Winter Soldier, and then later, I never really liked the villain so much until Black Panther came out.
Wait, what villain?
Killmonger.
Oh, okay.
He was definitely a clear villain, but you could actually
Relate to.
relate.
So
to
you didn't like comic one?
Well, I didn't. I thought the villains in the movies preceding Black Panther in Marvel were kind of just lame.
Oh, okay.
Like, they're kind of just forgettable. They're just there, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they try to kind of flesh them out, but they're just there.
I'm gonna pretend you didn't say anything about Winter Soldier right now. I'm
Oh,
gonna
no,
just go pretend I
Winter
heard
Soldier's an
that.
exception.
Oh, okay.
I said like between
Okay,
Winter
good,
Soldier
good.
and Black Panther. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, for sure, yeah. I think that was like, yeah, that what's it called? That I guess time in between those two movies was like the best movies until like Infinity War. Endgame, again, hand the Bible. Endgame was like an 8.5, which is really good,
Yeah.
but like Infinity War was a 10.
Which is funny because I actually like Endgame better than Infinity War.
This guy, you believe this guy? I don't know. I just felt like it should have been 3 movies. I'm gonna say.
No, I think you're perfectly
I
reasonable.
would have loved a movie where it was with, you know, in that future where there was like half the people were missing, and they just kind of lived with it.
You said you wanted to see more of that.
Yeah, I wanted them to. I wanted it to be a happy ending despite that.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah, you know what? I think that was one of my gripes of Endgame, because the Thanos that they fought at the end was past Thanos.
Mhm.
It wasn't Farmer Thanos. I was really, really hoping for Endgame to kind of showcase Farmer Thanos and him kind of wrestling with the ethics of his actions, because
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
was
I
hinted
know what
at
you
in
mean.
Infinity War.
Yeah.
And we didn't get that.
And they kill Farmer Thanos.
And I even
And like it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
I even had like a plot thread going around my head on how it would be Farmer Thanos that would eventually kind of save the day.
Yeah.
But it would be bittersweet.
Yeah. And I think that's something that like, I'm glad you touched on. Like, people and critics always talk about, like, we want more from these movies at this point. We want more like complexity, more twists and whatever. And but when something happens like in a way like such as like the way Endgame played out, they're like, okay, I'm glad this happened. This. But also at the same time, like, if you want to take that risk, people may not like that, or people will be like, calling it out, saying it's too confusing, they're trying too much.
That is another thing, that the ending of Infinity War was a huge risk. Like, you're not allowed to do that, but they were like, they didn't care.
Yeah, and even with like knowing that the heroes would probably come back, like that's still like you show people, you erase half the universe.
It was too happy of an ending for me. I don't know if it was like a CEO decision to like, oh, you have to save these characters and whatnot. But I definitely felt like Captain America should have died.
Yeah, and that would have been a good thing if it was a that would have been a good thing if it was a trilogy. Like have one of them die in this one, and then the other one die in this one.
Like, it really would have like held the weight of like consequences.
Yeah. Or like if Captain America had like done I don't know, if Tony had died in the proverbial second one, and then the third one, like Captain America died or something. Because I think they, like, you forget. Like, I forget about Natasha.
Oh.
Like, I just forget.
Oh,
Like,
I didn't feel
no one had a
I didn't
funeral
feel
for
that
her.
weight.
Yeah.
Just
They had like the 3 minutes of them mourning by the harbor, and then Hulk throws the bench into the woods.
Yeah.
He probably smushed some family picnicking in the woods.
I mean, had she had
a bunch of bears.
Had she had more likable development in the previous movies, I think the weight would have been felt. But I didn't really feel it.
I have a closing question for y'all. Okay, as a villain, who do you think is better? Lex Luthor? Like Lex Luthor, like the greater Lex Luthor, not like Jesse Eisenberg. Or Dr. Doom.
Ooh, wow.
And it could just be like your personal.
Yeah, they have very similar motivations. But I think I'm going to go with Dr. Doom.
Why?
And in the comics he does learn how to find a hybrid between magic and science.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like how he kind of plays out as that chaotic good, and how he's as a villain who's like full of ego. I like the way that he tries to commit stuff in the name of the greater good of humanity, or at the very least his own home country. With Lex Luthor,
Latveria.
Yeah. With Lex Luthor, it's hard for me to even appreciate any attempt that he makes in the name of humanity, because it kind of just. I said if I had to generalize and boil him and reduce his motivations, it would just be some jealousy to Superman.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's because I can't relate to the sort of xenophobia that he has for Superman, whereas with Dr. Doom, I'm kind of just like taken aback by his work with mysticism and science, combining the two, and how true he stays to himself, and at times where he might have to work alongside with the Fantastic Four. And also because of that one video game, the one where you can take control of 4 Marvel characters.
Oh, Marvel Ultimate Alliance.
Yeah, Marvel Ultimate Alliance. I really like that one
I would
because
just
of him as a character.
I would just get every Wolverine skin. That was my.
Oh, you played it before?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so
I have
good.
it, so.
So yeah.
That was one of the first, media that helped me to appreciate Dr. Doom, and then with other later storylines where the role that he plays, I really liked him as a character.
You can end it.
Well, all in all, everything that was talked about, I say that was pretty casual, man.
Yeah, pretty casual.
What do you think, Phil? Pretty casual?
That's pretty casual.
Join us next time for more casual conversations with Casual Bois.
Bye. Okay, next.